Cheap brake pads versus expensive brake pads. Which one's the best? The proven logic: with better brakes you can stop faster, thus meaning you can go faster. But is it down to the brakes or is it down to the brake pads? Let's find out. Disc brakes are awesome, but there's lots of trail chat about, do you need bigger rotors? Do you need more powerful brakes with more pistons? Then there's also lots of chat about, well, actually, cheap pads are fine. There's no difference. So we're going to dig into the science behind brake pads and friction, get some facts about whether you need better pads or not. To find out which is the best brake pad, the very cheapest one or the most expensive one, we're going to have an experiment to find out which one offers the most power, because that's the only thing that matters, right? Hang on, before we do a big experiment about stopping, we should probably explain how friction works on a mountain bike. Let's get into that. There's a really wide range of different hydraulic disc brakes on the market with, well, different levers, different reservoirs and different setups on the handlebar. We've got different hoses, whether it be braided or sort of a normal one like this. And then at the caliper, there's lots of differences too, from 2-pot to 4-pot to 6-pot. And I say pot, I mean individual pistons. But with all this diversity, how the actual brake works is all pretty similar. At the lever, there's a reservoir, and that's all connected to a hose. We run down the hose and we go to the caliper, just like this. Inside that lever body, we've got a piston. And as we pull the lever, that piston pushes the fluid. That fluid, if you remember science class, you'll remember that some fluids, lots of fluids, are non-compressible. So that force at the lever pushes down the hose and then here to the caliper, where it pushes the pistons up against the backing plate of the pad and then the pad against the disc. And this is where it gets really fun, because if you think about how big and how fast you can go on a bike, well, it all comes down to a really small surface area. That's your braking surface. It's pretty small, so it's important that it's the right stuff. Disclaimer time, we actually paid for these brake pads ourselves, from the Amazon specials to the very blingy Swiss one. So what have we got? Well, we've got these Mexital brakes, which I bought from Amazon, but you can buy from a couple of different vendors. And for this set of 4, it costs us £8 plus shipping. These are made in China. These ones are the resin ones. They do a sintered. Now, if you're not sure about those terms, we dive into all those details a little bit later. In the expensive ring, we've got the wonderful RS pad from Swisstop. These are meant to be the smoothest, most powerful brakes that the Swiss brand Swisstop do. And yeah, I've mentioned that country several times, so you can imagine where they're made. Okay, the price point on these is £30 for one set. So we've got a pretty good price range here. We've got essentially a £5 for a set, and we've got £30. Let's find out about the materials in these pads. With different pads, we get a different mix of materials in the pad. And those will be unique from company to company. But what we need to talk about first is the backing plate, because there's actually quite a variety there. You can get aluminium alloy, you can get steel, you can even get carbon. But why is that backing plate important? Well, friction, which is what we're trying to do, we're trying to increase the friction, equals heat. It's a byproduct of the process. And how those different materials cope with heat can affect your braking system. So if your braking system gets too hot, well, the pad can glaze, your rotor can get damaged, and essentially your whole braking system could get damaged if it gets overheated. Conversely, if something doesn't have enough heat in, so not getting enough heat into the pads, well, they're not going to operate at the optimum temperature either. So it is a fine balance between the two. Depending on your weight and where you're riding, often heat is the challenge versus not getting enough heat into them. Okay, back to the backing plates and why it matters. Those different materials that we use for the different backing plates handle the heat in different ways. Aluminium alloy, it is lighter, but it's going to transfer heat more quickly. And that means that, well, it potentially can go into your brake system, into the fluid, and affect it. Steel, okay, it's not as light, it's a bit more mass challenged, but it is a little bit more resistant to heat. And that can be a good thing. And if you choose really good steel, you might be able to make the backing plate thinner, which you might wonder, well, why is that important? Well, it could give you a little bit more space for more pad material. So making your brakes maybe better value. Now, touching on those carbon ones, I have seen them, and yes, they sound very racy, they sound very F1 and super light. Yeah, I've got no doubt they are super light. I'm sure they're super expensive too. I feel like it's a bit of an odd choice because carbon is, well, a really good material that's sort of not transferring heat, or at least in my experience. So having it as a brake pad material, well, it feels like you might just cook the pad and cook the rotor. Right, what's going on in the actual pad material? There's two main camps for pad material. We've got sintered and we've got organic, sometimes known as resin. Okay, sintered, these are metal, often nickel and copper in a mix, and well, they're a metal pad. And with the organic and resin, it is a resin base, but there'll be a mix of materials. Sometimes you'll get little bits of copper and nickel in there too. And this mix on either pad is where the magic happens. This is where the brake brands can develop the perfect properties for your brake. They can tune how grabby they are, how they feel at higher temperatures, or how they pull and how progressive they are in terms of ramping up the power. That's where the magic is in this pad mix. With sintered pads, there's some generalizations that apply to lots of them. Of course, the different mix of metals in your sintered pads will make them feel slightly different. But essentially, you will need more heat to get them up to temperature. And that can be a good thing. They can handle high heat as well. They can handle wet conditions and gritty conditions and last a little bit longer. However, they are often noisier. Now, in terms of the lever feel, that is slightly different. For me, they feel a little bit stiffer and less progressive. You get lots of power all at once, so there isn't like a nice ramp up of lever feel. And bedding in, from my experience, it always used to take longer to bed them in, but some brands say that actually it's shorter than resin because they transfer better. Resin and organic pads. As you can see from these pads, there are a mix of materials within them, so these are a generalisation and they might not apply to your brakes, but in general they do. That's that resin or organic pads are quieter. They give you a more progressive lever feel. They don't take as much to bed in and they don't take as much heat to get to the operating temperature that makes them work at their best. But they don't handle really high heat and high loads as well. They also, depending on pad material, can struggle in really wet and gritty conditions, but they will run quiet. Disc brake pads should be designed to the tolerances that the OEM, the original equipment manufacturer, should provide. So the brake pads should fit easily, but some of the cheaper pads that we've seen on the market have required a little bit of filing to actually fit them in, which isn't great. Should be noted that brake dust is toxic, so huffing it in, probably not that advisable. And related to that, what we've talked about the mix of materials in the pad, it is down to QC, and it is important that that quality control is there because it's in the radio control car world, so it is slightly different, but a very big brand has had to do a major recall on its disc brake pads because it was found to have asbestos in. So I think brands that sell directly into the UK, into Europe, into US, these things will be governed and they will be controlled quite tightly. But those brands that are selling, well, not directly in those spaces, well, if they're really cheap as well, are they going to put the QC in to ensure that that stuff that's in the mix of the brake pad is all legal and is all safe? That's up to you to decide. Depending on that mix of materials in the pad, well, that'll change what the bedding in process is. And each of those brands that make the pads should have detailed instructions on how to set it up. So, bedding in, yes, it is an essential. I've read some of the comments from folks online about, oh, I don't need to bed them in. It's fine, I just ride them. But it's a weird thing where if I told you that for free, you could get longer pad life and you could get better braking performance, I feel like you'd probably try it. And that's all that bedding in is doing. It's giving your pads the optimum chance to work in the optimum way. What it's doing is bringing the temperature up in the pad material in a controlled way. We're not just spiking really hard braking into it, we're gradually building it up. And for certain pad materials, that can be really good, and certain pad brands, it helps, well, almost cure the pads in, and it means that you'll get longer braking in terms of wear, you'll get better braking in terms of performance. So yeah, it's not a mechanic's myth, it's a real thing. So bed them in. Enough chat about tech, time to do some experimenting. We found a very steep hill to do this experiment on. We're going to go to that telegraph pole at the top, mark a line in the sand, roll down, and past this point here, I'm going to apply the brakes and see which of the pads, cheapest or most expensive, stops me soonest. I am going to put gloves on because the last time I tried something, well, quite similar to this, the first run didn't end that well, so safety first. This first run was with the Swiss Stop RS pads. So it's not highly scientific, but it's simple and effective. We apply the brakes at a set point. Okay, there's loose rocks, there's loose terrain, but this is where we stopped. We're going to do lots of runs and see where the average is for these really fancy pads, and then we're going to change things up. This is the average stopping for the Swiss Stop pads. Tool time. Now it's time to switch out the rotors and switch out to the much cheaper brake pads. We've switched over the rotors and the pads. We've already bedded those in, so let's see how those cheaper pads go. Wow, that did make quite a lot of difference, to be fair. It's really hard to control. You could hear the back brake screaming, which we didn't hear from the other brake pads at all. This was the average stopping point for the cheaper brakes. We'll walk up, and it is a bit of a walk up, to the average for the more expensive brake pads. So yeah, still going. Yeah, so this was the average point for the more expensive brake pads. And you can see it's, well, if I was being nice, it's 3 bike lengths. If I'm being sort of more realistically, it's probably 4 bike lengths. It's quite a big difference. But it gets more interesting because the shortest distance, when traction and skill all aligned with the more expensive pads, I actually stopped just here. Now, you can see that's a chunk of the hill far away. Okay, time to chat about the on-trail feel of these brakes, because I think that's something else that we've not really discussed, is how these brakes feel. Because it's not just maximum power, there's also modulation. So how these brakes sort of ramp up in power and how that kind of feeds back through the lever. I know that sounds a bit odd, we don't want lever feedback, but how you can feel where the bite point is of the brakes. And bite point, that's another key aspect of the brakes, is how quickly that power comes on. So is that bite all straight away and really fierce, so it's kind of hard to get a grip on? Well, particularly with my fingers, but maybe you're really skillful. Maybe you're used to having all that power at once. So there's lots of factors. I guess the other factor is that we've not discussed is wear. And wear is, well, it's going to be dependent on a huge amount of different things. So it's really difficult to talk about because it's going to depend on, well, how heavy you are, how heavy your bike is, how much kit you ride with. But then also things like, well, the geology and geography of where you ride. Is it really gritty? Do you ride in lots of wet and muddy conditions? All these are going to be factor with pad wear. How do these brakes actually feel on the trail? Let's find out. Tells a story just there, doesn't it? Okay, there's quite a lot to chat about on these, so let's find somewhere to sit down. How do these cheap brake pads feel on the trail? Well, you know what? First up, for £5 a pair, not bad. I've had experience of cheap brake pads before where actually the pad material has fallen off the backing plate. These haven't done that. So, you know, that's a good thing, I think. In terms of the performance and the lever feel, okay, the performance we've sort of covered in maximum braking, and the trail feel, well, for me and my braking style, they felt quite wooden. I think I like to just feather the brakes and feel a bit of the brake grabbing a little bit and then release to let the wheels roll through stuff. And with these, it was quite on and off. They were just, yeah, not great. The other problem for me was the noise. A little bit of water splashed up from a puddle, and these became the noisiest brakes this side of a sintered pad in the wet, which is impressive because these are an organic / resin pad. They shouldn't be that noisy, but these ones howled off-puttingly loud. Yeah, for me, look, price point, they do what they say they're meant to do. Okay, moving to the very expensive pads, we are talking £30 for a set of pads. The lever feel was really, really nice. I got lots of sort of modulation, so I could sense where the brake pad was gripping. And for me, I'm not a great rider. So for me, it really helped with wheelies. And I know that sounds daft, but finding that sweet spot of kind of wheeling, I just need to feather the brakes again. Back to me and using my skill and my control. It is so personal and so objective about how these things work. I think the other thing is, as well as having lots of power, lots of modulation in a really nice, controllable way, they were also silent. We went through similar puddles on this little test loop, and they were silent even through those. So yeah, for me, that was a big plus. It's a tricky thing to be subjective about brakes. They're so different, and people's riding style is so different, and how they use the brakes is so different. But for me, the more expensive brake pads were really nice. There's a lot going on with stopping a mountain bike, and well, there's lots of factors involved, but in our wonderful little experiment, well, unsurprisingly, the much more expensive brake pads were more effective. They did stop me quicker, and they felt much nicer, and they were much quieter. But there is a lot going on with this whole discussion, because they were a lot more expensive. And the cheap brake pads weren't that bad. But I think maybe framing it in a different way is a better option. So if you were trying to upgrade your brake system, either by bigger rotors or with more pistons, so a bigger pad and a whole new brake system, well, that could be really expensive. And whilst these pads were more expensive, compared to replacing a whole brake system with something more powerful, well, the more expensive pads do come across as more cost effective. Again, it's very personal, it's very subjective. What brake pads are you running? What brake system are you running? And have you tried the expensive pads? Did you like them? Or are you happy enough just to get the cheap ones and not worry about where they're from or if they'll last?